By the late 60s and early 70s, Satanism and the occult had fully infiltrated mainstream popular culture. Witches were front and centre of mainstream comedy shows like Bewitched, and blockbuster horror films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist were cashing in on the satanic panic, although these movies ultimately still adopted traditional Christian viewpoints on the occult. Devil bad, God good. However, away from the mainstream Hollywood studios, some art house and experimental filmmakers were making far more subversive and boundary-pushing occult movies. Across a period of 20 years, from the 1950s to the 1970s, experimental filmmaker and occultist Kenneth Anger made a series of short films that made up a collection called the Magic Lantern Cycle. These movies were influenced by the teachings of Aleister Crowley, and they all consisted of bizarre imagery that merged surrealism, homoeroticism, and the occult. Most of the films were completely dialogue-free and had no narrative to speak of, but due to Anger's own connections, many were filmic collaborations with hugely popular artists of the time, such as Mick Jagger and Jimmy Page. Rather than telling conventional stories, the films themselves felt like they were part of some kind of occult ritual, a mass. One of his strangest and most accomplished films, Lucifer Rising, ended up being nearly 20 years in the making. This is partly due to one key collaborator becoming a member of the Manson family and ending up in prison for murder. Lucifer Rising is perhaps one of the most pivotal occult films of the era, as its rebellious and daring imagery perfectly encapsulated the time. According to Anger himself, Lucifer in this film wasn't actually the devil, but a rebellious mythic hero representing the spirit of the artist. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the occult, and we dive into the surreal world of Kenneth Anger and Lucifer Rising. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one season at a time. We are currently in the middle of exploring the evolution of the occult in horror cinema, and this is part 7, in which, as the intro suggested, we're going to be looking at the work of experimental filmmaker Kenneth Anger. Now, this movie, although predominantly we're aiming to talk about Lucifer Rising, one of his short films, we're really going to talk about a whole collection of his films, the movies that make up the Magic Lantern cycle. And we're not really going to be spoiling any of these movies. I mean, you can't really spoil these movies. They're not really about the plot. So don't worry, particularly if you haven't seen all of the ones we mentioned. I don't think we're really going to spoil them for you because, to be honest, you haven't really experienced the films of Kenneth Anger until you sit down and watch them. But actually, most of his short films, they're all about 30 minutes max, and they can mostly, I think, be found on YouTube. So if you don't want to pick up the DVD, which I would recommend, there's a beautiful BFI DVD with all of the short films on there. But if you can't afford to do that, you can probably find most of these films and check them out online. Okay, joining me to discuss all things Kenneth Anger. Very, very excited to have him here because not only is he a regular podcast contributor, not only is he a brilliant film writer and scholar, but actually he is somebody who in his personal life has actually dabbled in the occult quite a lot, and he seems to have even brought along some magic spells along to this talk. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast Charlie Allbright.
Hello there, how are you?
Hello, I am so good. How are you?
I am getting there and looking forward to hexing the living shit out of everybody.
I'm so intrigued / scared because we've just started setting up for this podcast, and Charlie has brought like occult paraphernalia. But I mean, you've got something here that looks like a literal. Is this like some sort of magic spell? I don't know the word. I don't know the term for it. You've got something here that looks like a voodoo doll of a person with something sticking in it.
Yeah.
Just explain to me what this is, firstly, this thing. So what it looks like to me is a little plasticine, a black plasticine figure of a person with a matchstick stuck into its heart. Is that right? And what is that?
It is basically a puppet. It's part of what has commonly been translated into popular culture as voodoo. It isn't really voodoo, it's hoodoo. The idea is that if you wish something to happen to somebody, and yes, I could well have been given this by somebody, I could well have done it myself, who knows. The idea is that, yes, you get plasticine, you fashion it into the form of the person. Ideally, talking about, this is kind of very much, this is the kind of magic that's come into things like Hollywood cinema.
Right.
You get a piece of hair, yes, hello Harry Potter, or something like that, or a picture, and then you embed it into the form. This is just plasticine. People sometimes use clay. You can put oils on it to charge it, and by oils we're meaning literally things like, if you want to say get somebody to fall in love with you, you're talking about rose. It's that basic.
Okay.
And then yes, things like, it tends to work on a very literal symbolic level, in the sense of that things like if you want somebody to suffer heartbreak, put it actually their heart.
I love it. So I won't go too personal about this, but is this an active thing you've got going on here then, this thing that we've got in front of us? What can you tell me about it?
It could well be.
So this is a heartbreak spell.
Yes.
Oh my God, amazing.
It can be a way of getting your own fucking well back.
That's amazing. So tell me, clearly, first of all, let's start from the beginning. What's your kind of relationship then with the occult? Has this been something that you've kind of practiced in and dabbled in then throughout your life?
Oh, God, yeah. Okay, I'm going to be brutally honest about how old I am here.
Love it.
Basic gist is I came from a family of psychics, and we're not talking about great auntie Ethelbert or whatever. I actually have family heirlooms from literally my great-great-grandfather right back in the Victorian era. He used to run parlours where they used to do proper seances. This was before Wicca, Gardner, anything like that. It was very, very old stuff. And it supposedly comes down through the family line. And my parents always had kind of various occult books kind of around the house. However, at the same time, it was weird because my dad, way back in the day, trained to be a priest, or particularly a white friar. And as part of that, you learn how to do exorcisms. And he when he basically got bored of God, he became a pornographer. I shit you not.
As you do.
As you do. So I used to periodically find the photos hidden in like stashes when I was a kid, and my mother to this day doesn't know. And
really?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, she also worked on sex lines. And so she kind of was happy with the bit she was doing, but she didn't know he still did porn.
Right.
And I kind of grew up with stories of the Wiccans that my grandparents still knew around Sussex. And with the occult kind of crap that my parents had around things like, even the really basic stuff like folklore, myths and legends of Britain, the big chunky book that everybody had, through to things like just random kind of spell books. And I was fascinated by all this. I started doing kind of bits and bats when I was a kid, but when I went off to uni, I eventually ended up in Leeds. And they had, at Leeds University, they had a society that was called at first Pentacle, then Cabal. And the idea was it was run by this guy called John Tinsley, who was a guy from the OTO, which was Aleister Crowley's organisation, who wrote the book you have in front of you, Beginner's Magic.
Yes, okay, right.
And John was... he'd been doing it at that point for about 25 years. Bear in mind, this is about 20 years ago. And he was, as with most magicians, an absolute fucking genius.
Right.
He literally, there was nothing worth knowing he didn't know. And he was very into the kind of Thelemite side of it, which is what Anger was into.
Yes.
And it's terribly intellectual. Lovely dude, a hell of a sense of humour, brilliant to get pissed with. And
I bet, yeah.
And he started off running this group, which was basically just kids saying, hey, teach me about how to, invoke Satan and shit. And so he started off this group as a way of teaching people how to do basic magic. They asked me to go in the OTO on a number of occasions. I'll be honest with you, I never did, on the basis that I loved the idea of being able to change my world through magic.
Right.
In practice, with a lot of the OTO, which again is Crowley stuff, which then is Anger's stuff.
Yes.
It's a lot of sex. Basically, you go and do the Gnostic Mass, and you're basically watching the priest and priestess fucking on the altar.
Yes, okay.
So I ended up was far more interested, not in the, 'cause a lot of that kind of stuff, you're talking in Hebrew, you're talking in Greek, and a lot of the rituals are done like that. It's lots of learning Ponzi gestures, and it wasn't my thing really.
Right.
So I ended up going into an organisation called the IoT, the Illuminatis of Thanateros, which basically was like the punky ass chaos version, whereby you do whatever works. So yeah, you'll get bits of that. But then a lot of it is things like basic image magic.
Right,
it's sigil magic, which is things like drawing pictures as a way. The whole idea of the thing is to condense your will to make what you want to happen.
Right.
And I found that a lot easier to deal with, because it's so much of the older stuff is basically about, it's learning lots of very intricate old symbolism.
Yes.
And I mean, don't forget that the whole thing with the OTO was that Crowley decided that, yes, a God has spoken through him, and this is his book. And you're like, yeah, obviously, dude. He's making a fucking thing up.
Yeah, right.
And it involves learning lots and lots of stuff. And I just thought, nobody got the time for that, love. So
interesting. Yeah. Are these spells and that kind of thing supposed to be, is it literal, or is it more kind of symbolic?
Well, it depends. The main way that people tend to think of this, it's one thing that John talks about very, very well in that book, although unfortunately it's out of print now.
Right.
Is there's 3 different ways that magic works. You have the spirit model, which is whereby you believe that there is some kind of God you're asking to do it for you. Same way as prayer.
Yeah.
You've got the energy model, whereby you're doing something that supposedly somehow gets things in the universe that we can't see to do shit for us.
Right, yeah.
And then you've got the psychological model, which is whereby you're basically thinking, there ain't nothing out there doing it. You're simply conning your own brain into manifesting it.
Interesting, yeah.
And so in that sense, I mean, personally, I don't give a shit which way it's done as long as it works.
Interesting, yeah, okay.
I mean, so much...
So you don't fall kind of on one way or the other?
No, I've always been at heart a chaos magician, in the sense that I personally don't believe it's a particularly good idea to become too aligned with one particular belief system. Right. One thing that the Crowley lot tend to do, as with anger, is focus on particular belief systems, like say Egyptology. And I mean, some people choose to do that. With KO, it's what tends to happen is you paradigm shift, whereby you throw yourself utterly into a belief system for the duration that it's useful to you.
Yes.
For example, if you really want to become a good person in a Christian sense, you might suddenly start going to an evangelical church, become really involved, use the rosary, etc., etc., etc. Then once it ceases to be useful, you stop believing it. And you surround yourself with it, you become obsessed by it, to the extent that what my old tutor used to tell me was, you're doing it right when you start to dream about it.
Right, yeah.
And so you know those dreams where you get like stress dreams, where you dream that you're in an argument with somebody.
Yeah.
Rather than getting panicked, you might suddenly dream that you activate your chakras, and therefore you can kind of get them to blast off in the other direction. And so the whole idea of chaos, in particular in the system that I learned through that book, is that you find what works for you, and that doesn't enable you to become too obsessed. I mean, the whole thing about magic, to be honest with you, is everybody does it. If you've got a pair of lucky underpants, that's magic. In the same way that one thing we see in a lot of Anger's films is a lot of emphasis on things like picking up rings. We do that every, wedding rings, anybody?
Yeah.
It's basically, it's a piece of metal that you put on your finger. You do it in a ritualized form that people have choose to believe that means marriage.
Yeah.
And, if people lose the wedding ring, it's not just a sense that they are sad to have lost the memory of that particular piece of jewelry. It becomes part of the symbolism, to the extent that people will then, rather than maybe getting a different ring, they will have it kind of made bigger, made smaller, all the rest of it. I mean, it's one thing that's very interesting about all this stuff is the way we think about how the magic works. And one thing that I find with Anger's films in particular, one reason that they're so dense is that it involves a whole new set of symbolisms. One thing that when the kind of neo-pagan revival of particularly the 90s kicked off, when all of a sudden you got things like in Buffy, Willow getting into Wicca and stuff like that, was people suddenly thought, oh my God, I want to do magic, I've got to learn about Greek goddesses. And everybody goes off and suddenly thinks they're Greek. It comes down to what's known as correspondences. And there are basically 3 different types, which actually correspond to T.S. Eliot, who was kind of very much into kind of Christian mysticism. He talked about the 3 different types of culture, as in being, you've got personal references, say if you happen to associate the colour purple with your granny, it can become very comforting.
Right.
You might have your peer references, which are, you know, like a song that you might play to get yourself into the mood if you're going to go and do a magical rite that happens to be, I don't know, Blink 182, because that's what your mates always did.
Yeah.
And then you have your wider social and cultural references, which is whereby it's literally things that you might have grown up with, or if you grew up within the Christian church, things like crucifixes are very, very useful for magic because they put you into an automatic state of mind. All this stuff is about trying to focus will. I mean, if looking particularly at what Anger talks about in terms of Crowley,
yes,
they have the kind of key phrase of Thelema is love is the law, love under will, and alongside that, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Yes.
The whole idea being that your purpose in life, supposedly, it's one thing I do agree with. I'd probably be a Thelmite if I wanted a mad sexologist, to be honest. Is that it's your duty in life to find out what your purpose is.
Right.
Now, according to them, they kind of do it through a thing whereby the supposed end goal is communion with your guardian angel. I don't give a shit about that. I just want to have a good time. But you see what I mean? It's the same. You have the same route through lots of. You have the same goal through a lot of different routes.
That's amazing. What are your thoughts on Aleister Crowley then, in general?
He was a hell of a showman.
Yeah.
He was very typical, I think, of a lot of magicians and people like Anton LaVey, in the sense that he was a brilliant guy. He was a mathematician. He was a mountaineer. He was a writer. Yada yada. Profoundly bored very, very quickly.
Right.
And he basically sods off and decides he's going to create a religion because, after all, if you've got the time, you've got the patience, and quite frankly, you want the sex.
Yeah.
Why the hell wouldn't you? I'm being facetious, but it isn't really, because you tend to find that people who are that bright, I mean, to be honest with you, it's like when I was looking at this first time round at Leeds, all of the people who were doing it with me, they weren't your average students. They were all literally people who had been to, you know, the tutors had all been to Cambridge.
Right.
They were all physicists. They were all scientists. They weren't just random people who quite fancied looking at a couple of silly, you know, tarot cards.
Well, I guess it goes back to that origin of the word occult, right? And that kind of search for knowledge and hidden knowledge. Yeah.
I mean, genuinely, the people I know who have been really proper occultists, they are the type of people who really, they can do just about anything. They also tend to be very, very practical people. I mean, it's funny. I mean, like with Crowley, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit careful about what I say about some of the rituals I've done in the past, because yes, you can find all this stuff over the internet, but it's partly about a thing that somebody welcomes you into their group, you don't spill their secrets.
Yeah, of course.
And yet, you know, the thing that always tickles me is the big problem you're going to get with occultists is that it's not that you are going to be able to summon Lucifer, because quite frankly, if it's that easy, everybody would do it. It's more that with a lot of the paraphernalia that goes along with it, things like, you know, you'll have people taking various substances during rituals. I never did, I must say. I was totally British about it. I'd instead put it on my ear or something like that. So I'd never actually, I know it sounds so stupid, it's true. They used to take the piss mercilessly out of me for that. But, you know, you get people running around with, you know, sodding great swords and stuff like that. And if you, and to the extent, a lot of the people I knew who were part of the kind of Crowley scene, because they put this whole thing on. The whole idea of love is the law translates into numerology as the number 93, and they use it as a greeting.
Yes.
And the whole idea being that they're meant to have this really deep centre of love, so that if anybody had a fallout, it would be one hell of a fallout.
Right.
And so you'd have to be quite careful of people. And the thing with Crowley was that he knew that, quite frankly, like sex, it sells, notoriety sells. So hence when he, you know, the famous image of him kind of standing in the robes, you know, with his hands over, you know, part of the reason why Anger became, you know, for somebody who realistically did, you know, yes, he got awards, but who's so underground and whose films are so impenetrable. Yeah. You know, you ain't got dialogue to guide you along.
No.
You know, it's because he was very good at doing what Anger calls the kind of naughty little boy act. He makes it look really fun. It's like, even if you don't understand what the hell you're doing, I'll be honest. When I used to do the rituals at Cabal, I mean, John at one point wrote this thing called Thunder Perfect Mind, which is based on Gnostic practices. And we were all in there, and we all had these sodding pages in front of us, you know, lots and lots of symbols on. And there was about, God bless him, John was a genius, and he was kind of, he eventually lost his rag and just started shouting because not a single fucking one of us knew what we were doing.
Right, interesting.
And this was the thing with Crowley. It's like if you are somebody who naturally operates on that level, that works. Otherwise, he would quite happily just play the role and know that there would be people who would go along for the shits and giggles.
Interesting.
And that ends up funding a lot of the other stuff. I mean, if you take, there's other people like Lomilo Duquette, who is still active in, I think he's in San Francisco. And, you know, I mean, he does lots and lots of ritual magic. He's very, very famous. And yet the way he partly has made his money is he's a musician. He does, I think it's blues. And yet, you know, when you essentially sometimes see the photos that come out of those settings, God almighty, it looks like the absolute hippie dream.
Yes. Well, there's definitely a link, right, between, it's like you said, you know, sex orgies, drugs, you know, hippiedom, music, art, all of that, it all seems to kind of connect in some way, doesn't it?
Oh, massively, because quite frankly, if you know, I mean, let's put it this way, you've got two choices. You know, you can either sit and you can learn, you can do all that, or you can go to a party, meet some amazing people, because quite frankly, everybody goes along. They're a lot of fun. Get absolutely off your brains, fuck around, and you never know, if everything goes right, then something amazing will happen out of it. I mean, I'll be honest with you. The thing I don't mind saying is the stuff that I've done personally. You know, the reason I kept going with it, I tend to be oddly practical in this, in the sense that when it used to work for me, I would do rituals where we would put ourselves into a state whereby we would chant ourselves into a happy delirium. And out of that, literally, when I was on a roll, I would literally get hundreds of pounds appearing in my bank account overnight for no apparent reason.
What?
I know. I mean, seriously, deadly seriously. And I actually asked around, and you know, I eventually said to the bank, you know, what's going on? I said, seriously, it's completely legit. So I got jobs that I should in no way, shape or form got. We had a rescue cat that was basically about to die a truly horrible death. We did this ritual to the cat goddess, and miraculously it pulled around overnight. But you have to be on the ball. This is the thing. I mean, so much of this stuff, it depends on you having an absolute, you know, yeah, sure, you can have beginner's luck. I mean, most people who used to join the old society that I was part of, they would come along for the shits and giggles. They would do the first ritual that they did with everybody, which was basically kind of like a puppet, like a doll. But it was often things like passing exams. It would work fantastically, and they would absolutely scare themselves shitless and never come back again.
Interesting, yeah. That's
genuinely, that's how I lost most of them. And the whole idea is that with all this stuff, particularly with the stuff that I used to do, is it's very much results magic. The idea being that when something works, that's what sets you on your spiritual progression, because you have to deal with it. The stuff that Anger was doing, as we'll discuss, I would assume later on, particularly, was very much about communing with your higher self. And the idea being it's far more about the end goal. You know, it was a far more intellectualized way of doing it.
Amazing. So, you know, throughout history, in the media especially, occultism, witchcraft, all these kind of things have had very bad reputations for whatever reason. From your experience, I'd love to know, you know, is there anything ever dangerous about what you do, or occultism?
Yes,
really?
Very, very.
Interesting.
The honest dangers, it's not really... Okay, to do the Hollywood side first, you can do something that actually happens, and you have to deal with the consequences. For example, if you ill-wish somebody and they suddenly fall sick, you feel like shit. You know, I knew somebody who was absolutely convinced that he'd caused a car crash, and it put him into a profound depression. Honestly, that happens quite rarely. What does happen is that people can become obsessed. People can start doing bad practices. I've known a number of people who they've been doing it for years, and yet they would end up you know, unable to communicate with people in a way that wasn't involved in their magic. So it tends to be, I mean, some of the people I used to know, they literally did half of their rituals. And with chaos, you have to do, if you're going to become part of the IoT, which is what I was temporarily part of, you are meant to do a little something like meditation or a charm or something every day. So it's basically like a muscle that you learn to flex. Hello, Carrie. And they would record every day what they'd actually done. And it's like, not being funny, if you're using that much amphetamine over a course of weeks, you're going to drive yourself crackers.
Yes.
And if you are involved in the type of communities that do this over a period of time,
Yes.
it can be very easy to lose sight of, okay, you need to just chill the fuck down and have an Earl Grey.
Yeah. That's amazing. So when, broadly speaking, when you look at history, it seems to have become more popular and more ingrained in pop culture in the 1960s. Why do you think that is? Is that as a backlash to the kind of, sort of, I don't know, Christian right-wingism of the sort of 40s and 50s in America especially? Is that kind of reactionary, do you think?
I think so. I think the roots, I think, actually spread right back to the kind of 40s and the war period, because all of a sudden you have a group of people who are suddenly seeing mass devastation, and they're suddenly thinking, lads, we survived. Wow.
Yeah.
And so you end up with this whole idea of, okay, so what could we actually do? And you begin to get, the more you also get things like scientific discoveries, like things like the birth control pill. All of a sudden, civil rights, Martin Luther King, don't forget, happens like 63. You have this idea all of a sudden that everybody's lives have worth, and that people are not chained to these old traditional ideas of what it meant to be a man or a woman. So I think, let's see what other civilizations have talked about. So you get the whole idea of flower power, of through feminism, the idea of the divine feminine. And from this, so much of Wicca was focused on this idea of it being a goddess religion that would honour, in line with second wave feminism particularly, the whole idea of motherhood as being a state of divinity rather than just, quite frankly, a vessel for some dude's kid. You've also got things like the space race kicking off. And so all of a sudden you have this idea that, we could potentially start own the damn universe. And because also along this time you've got literacy increasing, historically so much of this stuff, like with feminism, had been the province of very, very, very clever men.
Yeah.
And it had been the province of people who'd often gone to Oxbridge. I got most of that shit from a little shop in Leeds. Nowadays, you can, I'll be honest with you, because it's so long since I've done the Thelmite stuff, so it just wasn't my boat. It's literally been like 10 years since I've done it.
Right.
And so I was thinking, shit, what's the correspondence for Red again? I was just randomly Googling earlier because I couldn't bloody remember. And it's amazing because there are actually really good sources online. Things like Chaos, for example. A lot of chaos started because people who first, were the first generation really to get onto the internet, like right back in things like 97, which is when I was a little bit before I was really involved. They all got involved because they were computer geeks.
Right, yeah.
And they literally, they managed to find each other on chat rooms and stuff. And so in that sense, it's this idea of essentially kind of transhumanism, this idea that we are not simply, stuck as we were born, that we can actually change stuff, and I love that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So tell me then, so that's really interesting, the kind of background of a lot was happening obviously in the 1960s. So Kenneth Anger, this is somebody who's, to be honest, was totally new to me until coming into this podcast. It's been really interesting. And just for people listening who may not know, let's start with the basics. Who is Kenneth Anger?
A guy with a hell of a lot of social and cultural capital.
Yes.
The basic gist of it was he was actually born into quite a middle-class home, but he described himself in a rather wonderful BFI documentary called Anger Me. As he was quite subversive, and he kind of early on, his grandma used to take him to the cinema, and he became quite obsessed with things like Shakespeare, things like Midsummer Night's Dream, and the whole idea was that from that he became quite interested in things like fairy tales, and from that he read a thing called, I can never remember the name of this, The Golden Bough. I couldn't actually see it on my bloody document. It's basically what it is. You can find it online very easily. It's a massive compendium of folkloric practices. Things like a modern version would be step on the crack, break your mother's back.
Right.
And he became very fascinated by this idea of daily practices as spells. And from that, he gradually began to, he ended up kind of getting to know people who were into occultism, and from that he kind of eventually got into Crowley. But kind of before that, he was one of these people who used to kind of be going around like I don't know, California and places like that.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. I mean, going around to just like these general haunts where he just generally lived, because he came from this middle class family. He, he had a kind of a camera rattling around, so he started making his own films. As you do, he was very lucky because his grandma got involved and stuff. He used to. It's the equivalent of kind of if you're in London like now, being able to sort off the Prince Charles Cinema every Saturday night and just knowing you're going to bump into a couple of filmmakers.
Yeah.
And he ended up kind of taking part in various bits. He ended up making his own films. He also happened to be gay. Mm-hmm. And so he ended up constructing this film called Fireworks, which has a guy with, it's basically firework in his cock. I mean, you've got to admire that image. It's gorgeous. I'm sorry.
Loved that film. I loved that film. Although that was the one that was basically like a kind of gang rape in a toilet. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We're going to get to all this. Do you know why I like that one most? Because it was quite short. It was about 12 minutes.
Hallelujah for honest.
But we'll get to that. So he made Fireworks.
Yes, it did.
And obviously at the time, right?
Yes.
I mean, we're going through obvious facts here, but, being gay obviously was illegal, right? At this time. This was pre-late, 1968 or whatever that was. So how, what happened with movies like Fireworks?
Well, this is the thing. It was considered to be something very, very new, but Anger was very lucky because the people he knew stood up for him. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was a guy who used to have tete-a-tetes with fucking D.W. Griffiths of Birth of a Nation. Right. And, people like Jean Genet, people like The Maids, that guy, blimey, if you want a twist, he's an amazing twist. Uh-huh. Came along to a screening of Fireworks. And when Fireworks was going through the whole thing of being processed, people were saying, do we call in the FBI? Is this obscenity?
Really?
And they didn't, because they decided, because of the way it was put together and because of the way he used the lighting and the kind of experimental techniques, even back in those days, there was this whole idea that, people recognised that, A, he was well connected, and B, it looked like there was some kind of artistic merit there. I mean, even just like over here now with the whole idea of the Obscene Publications Act, and the idea that, something has to be for educational benefit if it's not going to corrupt or deprave. There was this whole idea that, quite frankly, he was doing something for the service of humanity. Yeah. And so therefore it's like, hey, give him a pass.
I love it. That's really interesting. And it is a kind of interesting artistic video, isn't it? It's not just smut.
What's wrong with a bit of smut?
I know, there's nothing wrong with a bit of smut, absolutely. But I'm sure that's what people thought back then, especially. Right. Yeah.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, he actually, because he was playing to a very specific demographic of people, they kind of got him to say he had the glamour there. And importantly, I think, because he was so middle class and because he, at the time, he'd been involved in various kind of accepted, recognised filmic organisations.
Yes.
Quite frankly, his mates were people who could make stuff happen. He was also, because he was also middle class, he had what you call the habitus. He had, basically, you could see he was middle class in everything he did. He wasn't some bratty commoner. He was somebody who was learned and cultured, and who could talk himself out of shit. And you can still see it. It's interesting if you see the way he handles himself now. He's got that kind of, you are not going to stop me doing what I want to do, matey, look at his face. And it's interesting because it meant that he could do all the punky stuff without actively pissing anybody really off.
So interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
It's still got that slight kind of elevated genre feel to it, kind of thing, hasn't it? Yeah.
Well, this is the thing, because it's I think if you compare him to, I'm just trying to think who you would compare him to. He got away with sheer blue murder because he did what we know as canonization of the junior branch, whereby something that comes from Russian formalism. The idea being that he used, Christ almighty, it's basically just the easiest way of putting it is, if you want somebody to think you're clever, you start quoting Shakespeare.
Yes, exactly.
Because he quoted the right damn people, and he did it. He basically didn't burn the place down when he was making his films.
Yes.
Instantly people think, okay, you're somebody worth listening to. You're going to the right places, the right people, and you're putting things together in a way that seems to make sense.
It's so funny. It's quite, it's connected to quote unquote high art.
Oh yes, way, exactly.
That's so interesting. So again, so we from Fireworks onwards, he did what seemed like a collection of kind of short films, didn't he? How would you describe, in general? I mean, obviously all these films are quite different, but how would you describe a Kenneth Anger film? What kind of films did he make?
weird ones. I mean, there's some...
That pretty much sums it up.
Sorry, I'm going to be brutally honest. There are some of them that I actually really quite love. You've got things like Rabbit's Moon, which has 2 clowns in it. Hey, me clowns? Never. Shit, really?
Yeah, I know. Fancy that.
Yeah, seriously. From Rabbit's Moon, you've got like the figure of Harlequin, who is this trickster character. That's like, I need a wearable version of that damn suit. Where you've got this whole thing of, you've got then the Piero character, the kind of side clown who gets conned. You get Columbine there, and it's this kind of vague idea of a fairy tale going on, and it's very pretty, but it kind of involves vaguely about the characters. You've got things like Puce Moment, which are based on old screen goddesses. I suspect they're strongly related to the Thoth Tarot in terms of some of the symbolism, in terms of the idea of being a hermit and finding your own way. I'll be honest with you, things like Puce Moment brought me fucking rigid.
Me too. I wasn't that one. Yeah.
I will be honest with you, because I've never seen that before, and I think I've tried to watch it 9 times.
Yeah, it's hard. That was hard work, Puce Moment. Well, some of his movies are hard work, like you said. Some of them are really interesting, some of them are difficult. Yeah.
You've got Ode Artifice, which is actually in the Library of Congress, which you've got developments in filmmaking, such as the use of a woman of different size to emphasize size difference and emphasize the beauty of nature around them. But then again, to be honest with you, it just looks like a woman wandering around in a pretty dress for to the 4 seasons for a long damn time. Things like Scorpio Rising, which I love.
I love Scorpio Rising. It's so good. I mean, I mainly enjoyed it. Basically feels like a music video, like an early example of a music video. Love it. Really enjoyed the pop music, really enjoyed the bikers. It was great.
Hit the road down and don't come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road down.
To be honest with you, I mean, it's funny because when we come on to things like Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, Demon Brother, and all that kind of stuff, I actually think that Scorpio Rising is the most dangerous.
Interesting. So let's talk briefly about Scorpio Rising. What happens in Scorpio Rising? How would you describe it to people?
Nazis, sex and death.
Yes.
The whole gist of it. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I didn't know this until watching that documentary. He'd been floating around and found this motorcycle gang, and he started filming them because hey, gay, motorcycles, buff guys, all the rest of it. And he started following around, and it's like you start off with this whole thing of these really sexy guys. If you've got a foot fetish, this is one for you.
Yeah, this is so true. A lot of boots.
Oh, shit, yeah.
All right, calm yourself, Charlie. Calm yourself.
I am so screwed. Okay, and the whole idea is you've got them in all the leathers and all the rest of it. You've got lots of focus on the body and the bikes. For some reason, you've got this random bloody skeleton hanging over them.
It's so funny. It's so funny, and so many crotch shots as well of guys doing up their flies, doing up their belts. It's hilarious.
Oh,
but it's very watchable. It's very watchable. It is.
This is the thing. I mean, unlike some of his other stuff, you know the symbolism. I mean, when you get through to I know I've got fucking purple here. So glad there's no mirrors. But when you get to things like leathers, damn well it's looking at ideas of masculinity.
Of course.
But then again, it's also you've got these very high camp kind of biker jackets they're wearing, and yet it goes down this. It's partly camp because when he's kind of buffing his bike up and all the rest of it, you've got this skeleton kind of hanging over. It's like an unimpressed girlfriend. It's like saying, like, really, that's the highest you can buff it, and it's kind of weird.
You're right. It does have a camp element to it, and the music too makes it feel more camp, doesn't it? The music accompanying it, it
makes it feel oddly more realistic. Because,
it does.
Because I think the problem when you get these kind of this idea of people becoming obsessive, you get to a pitch where everything's black, everything's skeleton. It's like, oh Christ almighty, I've fallen into an emo video. Whereas when you see in this particular film, when you see things like he walks, 1 minute there's a dude kind of reading a cartoon, just like a normal kind of comic. So it's like, you can imagine this guy kind of having a childhood. Then you see him, he's wearing things like Nazi regalia, and you suddenly think, whoa, okay, so you can have somebody who can have both. And then he walks past a noose.
Yes, there's a noose. So yes, is that a sexual thing, do you think? Or?
Because I'm a miserable fucker. My thing was always, that if he gets, I kind of read that and it's a very personal reading. If he gets bored, then he'll just think, fuck this, not it.
Interesting.
Whereas I've seen other interpretations that he's actually a serial killer.
Oh, I see. I don't know what this says about my brain, but I just kept thinking, sex, sexy.
Oh, I love your brain. Strangle wanking for the win.
Yeah, I thought it was a strangle wank. I thought he's sitting in his room with his skeleton having a strangle wank. That's what I thought.
Exactly. And it would make sense, because I think the whole idea of horror, and I think the reason why this matters is horror to me is it's about obsession. It's about pushing things that little bit too far. The whole idea, I mean, for Christ's sake, the film The Craft.
Exactly.
It starts off as a game and ends up very much not. And so much of the reason why I think this film is the most frightening of all of them is that when you look at, basically he goes along, they end up on some kind of biking rally.
Yes.
It's then intercut with kind of what is actually, it's interesting, I found a load of things online saying that it was cut together with a fake religious film. It isn't. It was actually, or at least Anger said, that it's actually a religious film that had been misdelivered. It was meant to have gone to the Lutheran church down the road. And so you've got like a Sunday school film, and he intercuts the idea of Jesus with his disciples, with this biker gang.
Yes.
And they end up kind of going off on a they have like what we must assume is an orgy that ends up going too far, and ends up there's a dude who gets something squirted all over his stomach, and it seems there's pain. There's lots of kind of Foley art in the background. Yeah. And to me, the kind of horror of that is you get the whole idea of what we would now see as BDSM, whereby the whole idea of BDSM is you have safe words. It's all done within the context of respect, safe, sane, consensual. To all of a sudden not giving a shit and just thinking, the kind of what could be argued as being the bad side of occultism, especially what stuff that Crowley was associated with, whereby do what thou will shall be the whole of the law. In other words, bugger safe words. And so in that sense it could be seen as an exploration of if you are, the whole idea of Scorpio Rising is in the star sign, literally this idea of taking your own personal obsession and allowing it to go too far. I mean, the thing that happens at the end of this film, of course, is you have the biking rally where a guy dies, and that did actually happen. Anger said he actually, he was just with these lads, and one of the lads came off his bike despite having a helmet on.
Ooh, Jesus.
And so the last thing you see is the kind of ambulance going, the flash and blues.
And what do you think he's saying in this film then? Like you said, there's this biker, there's a kind of campy, quite fun element in the first half, campy, sexy fun. Then we get Nazis, and we get religion, and we get death. What's the idea behind the Nazi kind of symbology and everything?
To me, in this, it was very much about this idea of very much about power, and very much about acceptance of whatever your kink is. I mean, to the extent that you still get a lot of Nazi symbolism in a lot of fetish scenes. It's not unusual. Partly because, quite frankly, it was Hugo Boss who dressed the Nazis, wasn't it? I mean, come on, they look good. So in this sense, people. It's interesting because one of the. So it's hard to know, but one of the few arguments I ever had with any of the folks I knew in one of the particular organisations was this idea of how far does your free will go? And as I say, this person cannot be taken as a representative of anybody else in any of these organisations. I'm being careful here. But he basically said, if your will is to be a Nazi paedophile, then that is your will, and it is your moral duty to follow it. And it's
Jesus.
I am not joining your organisation.
Isn't that just so typical of any organised religion, right? You get one person that will use it as an abuse of power or whatever it might be. It's the story the whole world over with any religion.
Bingo, exactly. And it's what happens when, unfortunately, people like Crowley, and of course Crowley absolutely did not say anything like that, but the whole idea is that if you are going to talk about genuine free will, one of the problems you get within it is that we forget that the ideas that we are brought up within. Now, of course, any right-thinking person is going to think, oh, hellfire, Nazis, no, go away. It's the absolute pits. But then again, so many of our belief systems, and especially when you consider people who had at this time travelled the world, found different belief systems, quite frankly, they're all relative. And the thing that people forget about Nazism, of course, was that it wasn't just one dude at the top slapping a whip. You know, the whole idea was that average normal citizens voted for, you know, essentially, you know, kept him in power. I mean, you know, the whole idea that he came in by the back, you know, that Hitler came in by the back door. People did it. I mean, for fuck's sake, I mean, to go political for a minute. You know, the whole idea of people saying, you know, are you seriously going to vote Conservative after everything we know? The whole idea is that people will often vote with whatever the newspapers tell them to. And so the whole idea with, I think, of the horror of Scorpio Rising is that you get this kind of forgetting that just because these guys are really buff and they have these, you know, they forget that because somebody maybe appears to agree with being in a certain place at a certain time, it doesn't mean that then you just allow the scene to play itself out. Hence the whole concept of safe words that we have now. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I have no idea. You know, S&M is not my it's not my academic specialism. I don't know when things like safe words first came in. But so much of the idea of this becomes, to me, at what point do you think, fuck it, I'm going to do what I want to do, versus, you know, and experience what I need to experience, versus, and also on a spiritual level, what will it help me to do? Because the whole idea, one thing you tend to get a lot of in ritual magic is BDSM. The idea being, oh, for Christ's sake, I mean, you know, look at the whole idea of flagellation in Christian culture. The idea is that the more pain you get, it can help you to attain a spiritual state. The whole idea of sex magic is partly you use your physicality to trip your mind out so you can get stuff done.
Any group, any organised group or subculture can appear sexy and fun, but just be careful. It could, you know, things can go wrong, you know, with anything like that, whether you're a biker or, like you said, you're into BDSM or whatever it might be. It might not be that far from Nazism, which is an extreme message, but you kind of get it through what he's doing.
What is that? What is that? What is it? Oh, no, not the beast! Not the beast! Ah! Open my eyes!
Oof, now that's not nice, is it? Just when you're enjoying a lovely chat about Kenneth Anger, it goes and gets interrupted by Nicolas Cage from the awful Wicker Man remake in 2006. Now, the reason you heard a little clip from that is because that's a preview of what we've got going on Patreon this week. Yes, this is how much of a good person I am, because I actually had a request from one of our Patreon subscribers to cover the Wicker Man remake in detail. And as much as I hate the film, as much as I said I would never watch it again, I did. I rewatched the film and I sat down with Brad Hanson and we discussed the movie in depth. Brad, as I'm sure many of you know, is a huge fan and defender, an apologist for The Wicker Man. I hate it. So we sat down and we debated this film's merits, if it has any merits. I don't think it does, but there you go. If you want to check out that conversation, as well as a whole bunch of other bonus episodes, you need to simply subscribe to our Patreon channel. Just go to patreon.com/evolution of horror, and if you sign up and donate $5 a month to help support the cost of making this podcast, we will give you access to weekly bonus episodes, much like that one. Not only that, if you are a UK subscriber, you'll also get sent a free Evolution of Horror sticker, and everyone who joins up also gets a special shout out and a thank you on the main podcast. Speaking of which, I want to thank a few of the people that have signed up in the last couple of weeks. So a big thank you to Carol Beck, Ali B, Rory Laelvo and Jason Shaw. A huge thank you to all of those people for donating their hard-earned cash to our Patreon page. And one more time, if you want to join up, simply go to patreon.com/evolution of horror and sign up. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to our discussion of Kenneth Anger and his movie Lucifer Rising.
These movies, we should say, you know, on a surface level, these are experimental films. They appear, right? They usually don't seem to have any dialogue, and they don't follow a traditional narrative, etc. They can be anything from sort of 10 minutes, it seems like, to sort of 30, 40, 45 minutes. Are these drug movies? Would you describe them as drug trip movies in some way? Because again, you kind of associate it with 1960s drugs, that kind of thing.
I think so. I mean, it's one of these things that, I mean, I must have, when I was going over and over them, trying to get into them, things like, particularly when you look at things like Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which was actually based on a Halloween party, and whereby, I mean, the whole thing about those is he was basically, the whole thing about this Halloween party was the guests were invited to so-called come as your madness.
Yes.
And what they did was they all dressed up as gods and goddesses from various time periods. It's a process I strongly suspect known as invocation. It's a very traditional thing that you do within a lot of ritual magic, but Wicca particularly uses it, whereby you get dressed up as the god or goddess, you try and do things that they do, eat things that they would eat, and then you get into ritual, and then you basically kind of you do this right whereby supposedly they take you over, and then you act, think, talk as them, so you basically become like an oracle. And in that sense, I can imagine that the people who were involved in that would have been absolutely off their nuts in the first place. In terms of their actual effect, I mean, one thing that Anger has said, which is fascinating, this is what I love about him, in theory anyway, is that the whole idea of the magic lantern cycle is he intends his films to be used as a ritual. The idea being that if people, and it's something he's done that other Thelemite artists have done. There's a band, for example, called Current 93 who do gigs whereby you go along to the gig and you are taking part in the ritual. Interesting. They do the ritual around you. Led by a guy called David Tibet, who is a Thelemite. And the whole idea of this stuff is that, you are watching what is essentially, with things like Inauguration of Pleasure Dome and stuff, you're watching them cast a spell on you.
Interesting.
And the whole idea is the kind of colours they're using. Things like, when you've got things like strong reds. When we're thinking right back to what we were saying about correspondences, people think about the colour red, they think passion, they think danger, and it makes them, seeing lots of red and seeing this kind of, the cutting techniques and, all this, the camera work and seeing people going off their nut in a way they weren't used to seeing. It's almost like this license to the audience of get into it.
Yeah, there's the sound design too gives you that, doesn't it? There's this one, I can't remember which one it is now, but there's one that just kind of the background music is just this kind of like repetitive noise, like a siren or a drone or something, and it almost feels like it's like one of those like kind of like hypnotic brainwashing videos or something, doesn't it?
I think so. I must be honest, I love the theory of what he was doing. I find the occult films really utterly impenetrable, nigh on boring. Sorry, guys,
they are. I think that is true. Yeah, that is true. Like we said, we both enjoyed Scorpio Rising, but some of them are hard work.
The drone stuff, I am pretty sure, was actually from Invocation of My Demon Brother.
That's it. Yes.
And that was actually played by none other than Sympathy for the Devil himself, Mick Jagger.
That's right. yes. That was a particularly strange one, wasn't it?
Oh, it's delicious. It makes total sense, though, because again, everything is rock and roll. Everything, to this day, for Christ's sake, when last time I was doing the ritual magic stuff myself, the last kind of really big thing I did was I did a series of paintings that I did in trance states. Yes. Whereby I do know what I was doing. I was doing weird stuff with weird things. And I ended up exhibiting them literally all over the world because it was fun. Because quite frankly, regardless of how good the quality of the painting is, it's got a fucker of a good story.
Yeah, right. And yes, it's more about the story behind the art a lot of the time.
It really is. And people like Jagger, it gives an extra kind of, the whole idea of glamour, for God's sake. It basically means, and again, hello it, there's a massive section in it on this, it becomes this whole idea of projecting a guise to get what you want, to encourage a certain kind of behaviour. And the whole idea with the sound design on things like, as you say, Invocation, is that you're supposed to end up mesmerised. I mean, the whole thing about the Demon Brother, whereby you've literally got this guy who is, you've got a lot of shots of people, for example, reading tarot cards and all this kind of stuff. Demon Brother is supposedly a reference to Lucifer. Lucifer, in a sense, not being big bad devil, but the bringer of light. In other words, it's your higher spiritual self.
Right.
And the whole idea, when you consider, in a lot of ways, the biggest difference, I think, between a lot of the kind of the Thelemite stuff and the Christian stuff, it's all about, you're down there, you've got to pray out there to God.
Yeah.
Thelemites say, fuck that, I am God.
Yeah. Yes,
I love
that's
that.
It's kind of the seeking of power themselves, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Which
Really
is considered to be obviously this massive, massive sin.
Yes,
and yet,
blasphemous. Yeah,
well, exactly, completely, and hence the whole idea, that people get terribly confused between things like Crowley as being the wickedest man in the world versus, Mr. Satanist Anton LaVey, who himself was also just a fairground bark. He was another bloody showman.
Well, we talked at the beginning of this series about, you could things that were once accused of being occult were, scientists discovering that we go around the sun, or that, Darwin or whatever. It's anything that kind of, again, seeking knowledge and seeking power through knowledge, isn't it? Yeah,
Bingo.
It's so interesting. Like you said, we've got people like Mick Jagger involved in these films. Later on, we've got what's his face from Led Zeppelin as well.
Oh, Jimmy Page.
Jimmy Page.
Yes.
These movies do have big names, but it kind of makes it cool in some way, right? These movies were quite cool. Where did they play at the time? Because I'm assuming they weren't playing in every kind of general cinema that a family could go to and check out.
Oh no, I mean, to be honest, names of the cinemas, it's slipped my mind completely here. But
of course,
it used to be. I mean, a lot of the time it was things in the local area. People would go to. It's really in a lot of ways no different to everybody buggering off down places like the PCC.
Exactly, that's what I imagine. Like, I guess, like kind of late night kind of movie. Yeah, the sort of people that would go see John Waters or Eraserhead or anything a few years later, right? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Hence, people like John Waters. When you consider things like his use of soundtracks, funky soundtracks. Again, very much the idea of that from Anger, again from Scorpio Rising.
Yeah, I did feel a kind of there's a vague connection. I wondered whether or not he was an influence on John Waters, because obviously there's that kind of camp element, but stylistically there's something quite similar, I think, isn't
exactly
there?
And also what do we call it? Twin Peaks.
David Lynch, of course, yeah.
Exactly, and so much of the idea there of the contrasting images. This kind of surrealism that you're kind of thinking halfway works, halfway doesn't, because so many of these images we kind of half know but only half. And one of the fascinating things about things like Lucifer Rising, for example, where you've got Marianne Faithfull kind of wandering around being Lilith. People may not have a sodding clue, especially back then, who Lilith was. No. Because a lot of these things were playing to people who were massively into the occult scene. Because it was things like, half these guys met through things like auctions, art auctions and stuff like that. And so while you would, some of them may have had an idea, when you've got people like Marianne Faithfull who, recorded a number of songs absolutely off her nut, and it shows. Brilliant, but off her nut. And for Christ's sake, when she was filming that, she apparently had heroin in her makeup case.
Oh my God.
And it's, you can see because she does look tripped out, and so it kind of adds, again, this idea of this is what the stars are doing.
It's a whole new meaning to powdering your nose, isn't it?
Oh, yes!
So let's finish by talking about Lucifer Rising then. One of his most famous, I would say, what is Lucifer Rising? What is it about? Because, your guess is as good as mine.
You absolute bastard. Ostensibly, it is a reflection of the Thelemite ideas that the world has gone through different ages, and you have various different actors playing characters representing the gods and goddesses of different ages. So, for example, you will have Isis, you'll have Osiris through Egypt and so forth, through the medieval period. And then the idea is it eventually comes out to Lilith, and the idea that we are now in the new eon, the eon, I think, of Horus, the idea of the child. And the idea is that this is, quite frankly, our time. And that humanity is going to change and ascend. And so, therefore, you have lots of depictions of things like people going through ritual. You have things like lots of Egyptology in there, because that's don't forget that in terms of people like Crowley had come up through things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which they loved their Egyptology, because quite frankly, one thing the one thing that you can always find with ritual magicians, they know I've got a thing about velvet.
Yeah, well, you can see, there is an element of it, isn't there, where it's like, let's pick the coolest, sexiest looking symbology and everything else, iconography, you know?
It really isn't. It is very sex-based. I mean, seriously, when I used to go to Gnostic Mass, you would often get it whereby the kind of the main rite would be performed, you know, people would be getting the kind of Eucharist, and the priest would be looking out the priestess on the altar.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah. But the whole idea of this is that when you then bring it around to things like Lucifer Rising, it's this whole idea of not being ashamed of the body. And you know, when you get to the whole thing of eventually getting incorporation things like Stonehenge, you get Anger often played roles in his films himself.
Yes.
There is just this idea of almost being, it's partly like a willingness to trip out and just experiment.
Yeah.
Not be afraid of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Partly also, I'm convinced he said that you know, the whole idea of the flying saucer and all that kind of crap that you get in his films as well is a reference to some Egyptian symbolism. The idea being that there are other forces in the universe that we simply haven't discovered yet. Personally, I just think he's fucking with our heads, but that's by the by.
Yeah.
Because so much of this stuff, it's funny. I mean, when you look at some of these films, I'll be honest, they're po-faced as fuckery. They are,
aren't they? Yeah.
If you don't know the symbolism, you're just thinking, what the hell is going on here?
Well, totally. I must admit, I watched these films and I was completely lost. I didn't have a clue what I was looking at, but I enjoyed it in a very kind of superficial way. Particularly Lucifer Rising, it felt like it had a bit more money behind it. It was glossier, it was colourful, it had a lot going on, didn't it?
Yes.
It's quite beautiful, actually.
Oh, exactly. They are beautiful. I mean, to me, purely as a personal taste thing, I wonder how effective, I mean, in terms of, it's interesting. I wonder how effective it would have actually been, because he obviously intends this as a form of initiation for the audience.
Yes.
And realistically, a lot of his audience would have been people who knew that symbolism, because it was a very select audience. As you say, this isn't playing down your local multiplex.
No.
At the same time, the symbolism is so dense that otherwise it's impenetrable. I mean, I would love to know if you did get absolutely off your nut on something like acid, if it made more sense.
I bet it does. I felt like I'm way too sober for this film when I watched it.
Well, exactly. And it's I mean, the whole thing is done around the basis of timeframes as well. So presumably if you had it as like an experience whereby you have like, I mean, I think it was Lucifer Rising actually, whereby he had it projected on 3 screens at a particular festival.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
I can imagine that working, because the whole idea is then you're not kind of sitting at home within your own room. Instead, you are with people who it becomes a congregation.
I agree. It makes so much sense, actually, what you said about how these are like a ritual, because I feel like it must be very important as to the circumstances of how you watch these films. And I don't think me sat in my living room with my laptop was necessarily the right way to watch these films in some way, you know? Yeah, you're not going to get that experience maybe that Anger wanted.
Well, exactly. I mean, when you think about the basic process, the basic process of a ritual, the whole idea, especially in this kind of way of thinking, is that you would start off by cleansing the space. Cleansings go from anything from like a basic where basically you just enunciate like that particular phrase, and it's known as the Sufi Vanishing,
right.
Whereby, you know, you before you actually kind of start off, you cleanse the space, you wash, you get ready for your night out, you then go to the space, and then you welcome people on stage. That's, you know, kind of translates into what's known as the welcoming of the elements. And a lot of the elements are things like the kind of rituals that Anger would have done as part of the OCO, and that reflect in here is things like you know, literally calling the people into space, in the sense of you will have somebody appearing in a you know, really gorgeous costume that some people recognise, and so in that sense you're invoking the elements. It's the kind of thing you get on the craft where they say hail and well met to the sun, the moon and stars. You then have the main thing where they'll get shit-faced or whatever and fuck. And then at the end you have the dissolution, whatever that may be, and then the thing closes down whereby you're saying, you know, you so-called banish the elements and everybody goes home. And then the idea is, of course, you often don't kind of, you know, people go home, but you then don't clear the space, because that would be to undo the magic.
Right, interesting.
It depends on what kind of rite you're doing, but the whole idea is that you can actually map on the idea of what is a ritual works the same way in Christian church.
Yeah,
If you
yeah,
think about it,
yeah.
you welcome God. Pray
Absolutely.
for us, Mary.
Yeah.
It's the same damn process.
Yeah.
And it literally, your participation becomes a ritual.
And so that element of it is probably, like you say, important to screenings of films like Lucifer
Bingo.
Rising. Yeah, really interesting. And tell us, I mean, briefly, you know, I know there's a lot behind this movie. I think that originally he wanted to make it in the 1960s. It didn't get shown until the 80s, blah, blah, blah. The involvement of Bobby Beausoleil, I believe his name is, isn't it? And and what happened with him. Let's briefly chat about that. Who was Bobby Beausoleil?
Basic gist is that they'd been knocking around the scene,
Yes.
and Beausoleil was a member of a band.
Yes.
And Anger had been looking for a rather lovely young man to be Lucifer. It's like, I wonder why he wanted a lovely young man, darling.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know.
And so he asked Beausoleil to join in, and Beausoleil says yes. Beausoleil ends up moving in with him temporarily. The problem was, and very much one for the film buffs here, Anger is the epitome of an auteur. He wants everything his own bloody way. And indeed, you know, one of the reasons why you could argue he has become so famous is that he's often said that the reason why his films worked as they did was because he was adapting what he could do to the film process, including with Bobby, because Bobby wanted to have too much input.
Yes.
They ended up having rows.
Yes.
And so
Basically became a bickering couple, didn't they?
exactly. So Bobby fucks off.
Yes.
And so Angus says, okay, well, who else can we get involved? Mick Jagger contributes. That soundtrack ends up elsewhere. Oh, God. Jimmy Page ends up doing the music for it, I believe.
Yes.
Eventually, Beausoleil, who of course ends up one of the Manson family, who ends up in the nick for stabbing somebody.
Yes.
You know, he basically sods off as well with half of the footage from what would be
That's right.
Lucifer Rising.
Yeah.
As you say, bickering couple time. Gives it to Manson, who says, right, I'm going to bury this in the desert, $100,000 to get your footage back.
I love it. And they never found it, did they? So Manson buried that footage in the desert, and it's still out there somewhere, buried in the desert.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Basically. And
Brilliant.
Eventually, like 10 years or so later, Anger's over here, he's got together with Jagger and all the rest of it, and eventually what ends up happening is he goes back to Buster and says, you know, would you mind doing a bit more? You know, just doing a soundtrack. And Beausoleil says, yes, and he actually records it in prison.
Yeah. So that soundtrack was made by Beausoleil in prison, right? Really interesting. It's really interesting. I mean, it's amazing how much all of that is kind of like wrapped up in all of the stuff going on with the Manson family. Obviously, last week on the podcast, we discussed Rosemary's Baby, talked about obviously Polanski, Sharon Tate. I mean, it's amazing how much crossover there is in amongst all this kind of 60s and 70s pop culture, occultism, film, art, television. All of it is connected, isn't it? It's so interesting.
I mean, to be honest with you, the most fascinating thing, particularly about having Beausoleil involved, is because a lot of this comes down to basic art semiotics, in a sense, and it's actually fascinating because when people talk about semiotics, they tend to think purely of Ferdinand de Saussure, the whole idea of signifier and signified.
Yes.
Signifier is what you can see, hear, smell. Signified is what it means.
Yes.
Yes, my lecture hat is now very
I
firmly back.
love it. Yeah.
But in respect to Anger's films, you're actually far better off with a guy called Charles Saunders Peirce, who talked about the signifier in particular as having three different parts or three different types known as modes. You have the symbolic, which is a learned sign. In other words, things like an exclamation mark. It's just a dot with a line on it. You have iconic, which is where the image gains power because it's seen so much, things like Marilyn Monroe. And you have indexical. Indexical is where it comes from the person.
Right.
It's a direct product of that person. So in this sense, the idea of having a film that's been constructed from images of real people who are actually doing this, not just actors, and more importantly, people like Beausoleil, who have genuinely done things that people would consider to be beyond humanity and have experienced the idea of taking a life with all the kind of the ideology wrapped up in that.
Yeah.
The idea is that actually, in the same way that handwriting and even a person's hair can be considered as being a representative of that person, of their magical essence, if you will.
Right.
All of a sudden, you have a film that actually has part of a murder in it.
Jesus. So this actually adds something to that art and that film.
Bingo. All of
Really
a sudden,
interesting.
it renders it magical.
God, that's so fascinating. So how much do you think it's important to know all this when you come to a film like Lucifer Rising? Because when you do watch it, not knowing a thing about Anger or what you're about to see, I think so much of that is lost on you, right?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting to know a bit of that first.
I mean, I must be honest, part of the pragmatist in me kind of thinks, well, is this purely psychological magic? In the sense of it's there purely because you know about it. But to me, I think I do think there's more to it. At the same time, I think if you genuinely have been to those psychological places, it's going to alter the art product that you leave behind.
Yeah.
And if you are genuinely, I mean, bear in mind who's likely to just randomly stumble upon this stuff. You're going to be open to it. You're probably going to be, rather more open to being changed by it, because otherwise you aren't going to be there in the first place.
Yeah. Lovely. So finally then, for people out there who want to kind of introduce themselves to Anger's work, where would you recommend they start?
I would have said Scorpio Rising.
Yeah, I agree. There's something a little bit more accessible about it in a weird way, I think, isn't there?
There is. I mean, bizarre enough, things like Fireworks I've really enjoyed, because, I'll be honest with you, I didn't actually check back over this, but one thing that fascinated me about it is you have like this model hand in it the whole time, and I thought, is that the hand of glory?
Yeah.
The whole idea of a hand of glory is it was an English folklore tradition whereby you could set a pickled corpse's hand on fire and it would keep burglars out of your house.
Love it.
And so I was kind of thinking, there are kind of vaguely folkloric elements that we can also pick up on, if nothing else. It's really interesting to see how it's put together, because you can at least follow the narrative quite easily. Because, to be honest with you, in terms of occult filmmaking, I really can't think of that many films that are really a very good representation.
No.
Bizarrely enough, you've got things like the old style Hammer stuff, but quite frankly, God bless them, that's hokey as shit.
Isn't it funny how different, how far behind they were while all this was going on? This kind of groundbreaking, bold stuff. Next week we're going back over to Britain and we're talking about The Devil Rides Out, which is what a wonderful film, but there's something so kind of like quaint about it in comparison to what we've been discussing, like Scorpio Rising, right? It's so funny.
To be honest with you, it's really random here, because I was thinking kind of on the way over, okay, so what do I think is the best occult film?
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, I was going over all Hammer stuff, like, you fucking liar. The one that I genuinely think is best is Harry Potter.
Interesting.
Genuinely, because if you think about the way the magic works in that, yes, sure, they have to learn all the kind of Expelliarmus, all Latin and stuff like that, which you do get in here. But what makes it work, particularly in Harry Potter, is they have to concentrate. You remember the bits, I don't know which one it is, but where they have to, they're in Flitwick's class and they have to get a feather to rise.
Yes.
And Ron is whacking his wand around. He's not concentrating. He explodes the bloody thing. And that is far more the idea of what ritual magic is like, on the basis of the fact that, yes, it involves learning, but it involves mentally keeping control. Because it's only because of keeping control that you can actually enact change in accordance with will.
I love it. So finally then, again, I want to ask you, for somebody who wanted to, for somebody like me who is never dabbled in this kind of thing and is as boring and vanilla as they come, where would you start if you wanted to learn a little bit about this world, about the world of occult, about the world of magic? Is there a book, that you'd recommend or anything like that?
So it's a good question. Probably in terms of looking at magic as a system rather than as a set of beliefs, probably things like Condensed Chaos, which I think is by Phil Hine. That's very much about chaos magic.
Right.
And the thing is, to be honest, one of the reasons I love them is, as I say, very punky attitude. You can read them, you can understand them, they're very funny. Because a lot of this stuff, it goes very po-faced, still very much, it's written by very learned people who are, basically, they're saying, look at my library. And it gets very intimidating. The thing is, you often find you can't read them. And just look at what you already know. If you already chuck a pinch of salt over your shoulder for luck, you're doing magic. It's the same damn thing. Keep it simple, keep it stupid.
Love it. Charlie, thank you so much. I feel like this is the sort of thing I could ask you about for another 6 hours, but we have no time left. Thank you so much for joining me, Charlie. Where can people find you out there on social media and the rest of the world if they want to come find you and pick your brain about this stuff?
Oh, good. Well, I actually now have a blog.
Hey.
I actually did it. Magic. I had to fucking something to get that one in. Which is, I think it's drcharlie.blog. It's easy to find. I'm also on Twitter as Dr. Charlie Allbright. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, you name it. It's basically a mixture of Stephen King, ceremonial magic and squirrels.
Brilliant. What more could you want? Thank you very much.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to my brilliant guest, Charlie Allbright. I can think of no one better to have sat down and discussed those movies with me than him. Such a treat. I really hope you guys enjoyed listening to that as much as I did having that conversation. Please do get in touch with me and let me know your thoughts. What's your favourite Kenneth Anger movie? What do you think of his films in general? Do they still hold up today, or are they very much a product of their time? Get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, on Facebook and on Instagram. Don't forget you can also follow us on Letterboxd, and that's where we reveal every single movie we're going to be covering in the series so that you can keep up to date and watch them in advance. You can find all previous episodes of this podcast on our website. Simply go to evolutionofhorror.com, and we are going to be encouraging more and more writers to contribute to the website's blog section. So if you're a writer, or if you're an aspiring writer, or if you've got an idea for a particular piece that you want to write about the horror genre, or a review or an essay, anything you like, send through your ideas. I'd love to put some more written work on the website. Just email me at evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Acast, Libsyn and Spotify. Please do subscribe to us. Please do spread the word about us. Tell your friends and family about us. Tweet about us. Facebook about us. Every little plug helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, on to next week then. Well, while all of this boundary pushing and bold and daring, interesting, innovative stuff was going on in America, back over in the UK, we were still taking things a little bit slower. We were still a little bit more traditional with a lot of our mainstream horror. Next week, we are returning to Hammer Studios, and I'm going to be discussing some of the occult movies that were happening at the same time as movies like Rosemary's Baby and Lucifer Rising, but were perhaps a little bit more traditional in their storytelling. I'm going to be joined by Graham Saunders, and we're going to be talking about the films based on the stories of Dennis Wheatley, mainly The Devil Rides Out from 1968, and then To the Devil a Daughter from a few years later. We'll also be mentioning a couple of other Hammer films that dabble in the occult, such as The Witches from 1966, but the main spoilerific reviews will be those two Dennis Wheatley ones, The Devil Rides Out and To the Devil a Daughter. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.